I was ordered to burn this journal in 1945. The officer said what happened at the outpost never officially existed. No maps, no names, no survivors worth counting. But memory doesn't obey orders. In 1941, deep in a jungle the Reich barely understood, my unit was sent to occupy an abandoned Allied station swallowed by vines and rot. The radios still worked. The generator still hummed. And yet something had driven everyone else away. At night, we heard footsteps where no men stood. Shadows moved against the torchlight without bodies to cast them. The locals refused to speak its name, only crossed themselves and vanished into the trees. We thought fear was the enemy. We were wrong. Something else had claimed that outpost long before we arrived. Welcome to Combat Lore Files, where the shadows of war live on. Hit subscribe and get nightly drops of stories like this. *, some missions arrive with coordinates. This one arrived with silence. The order came folded inside a plain brown envelope, no unit insignia, no routing stamps, just my name typed cleanly, as if someone didn't want their handwriting remembered. I was a Gefreiter then, part of a routine jungle patrol attached to a German expeditionary force operating far from Europe, in territory the maps showed only as green emptiness. Our days followed a rhythm of sweat, insects, and distant gunfire. Clear villages, check supply trails, move on. But that envelope broke the rhythm. The paper inside was thin, official, and strangely vague. IT instructed our squad to report immediately to a forward staging area and prepare for reassignment to an outpost recently vacated. No grid reference. No prior unit listed. No explanation as to why a reinforced patrol was needed for an empty position. I remember reading it twice. Then a third time, convinced I'd missed something important. There was nothing there. When I brought the paper to our lieutenant, he read it once and folded it back without comment. He didn't look at me when he spoke. He just said, "Pack light, we move before dawn." That alone told me something was wrong. Officers always liked to talk about objectives, about glory, about how history would remember us. This time, there was nothing. No speech, no reassurance, just orders and silence. The men felt it too. You could hear it in the way conversations died as I passed, in the way hands lingered on rifle stocks a little longer than necessary. That night, as rain drummed on canvas and the jungle hummed like a living machine, I heard one of the veterans whisper that this reassignment wasn't in the regimental log. Another said he'd asked a clerk where the outpost was and received only a shrug and a warning to stop asking questions. We marched before first light. The jungle swallowed us almost immediately. Green walls of foliage closed in. Vines snagged our packs, and insects crawled into every crease of cloth. The air smelled of rot and wet earth, heavy enough to choke on. Radio contact was poor from the start. Bursts of static, voices fading in and out like they were underwater. Our guide, a local auxiliary pressed into service, walked several paces ahead and never once looked back. He wouldn't meet our eyes when spoken to. And when someone joked about ghosts in the trees, he muttered something in his language and made a warding gesture I'd never seen before. That should have been my first real warning. By mid-morning, the trail disappeared. Not ended, vanished, as if it had never existed. We relied on compass headings and the guide's instincts, pushing deeper into terrain that felt untouched by war. No shell craters, no cleared paths, no signs of recent movement. Yet the order insisted this outpost had been occupied, then abandoned recently. The contradiction gnawed at me as we moved. The jungle grew unnaturally quiet. Birds stopped calling. Insects faded to a low, distant buzz. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears, making you aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat. I caught myself scanning the tree line again and again, convinced something was pacing us just out of sight. We halted briefly near a shallow stream to check bearings. That was when I noticed the maps. Our lieutenant spread them on a rock, but the area we were in was little more than blank space. No markings, no elevation notes, no military symbols. Only an old pencil line someone had once drawn and then partially erased, as if unsure it should be there at all. When I pointed this out, the lieutenant snapped the map shut and told me to focus on my sector. His voice was tight, controlled, the kind men use when they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. I realized then that even he didn't know where we were going, only that someone higher up wanted us there. As the day wore on, signs of abandonment began to appear subtly at first. A rusted ration tin half buried in mud. A length of wire cut cleanly, not torn or broken, But no footprints, no shell casings, no signs of combat. It was as if a unit had stood up one day and simply walked away without running, without panic, without leaving the usual chaos soldiers leave behind. That unsettled me more than any ambush would have. Even in retreat, men leave traces, fear is messy. This was clean. Late in the afternoon, the trees thinned, and we saw it through the mist. A cluster of low wooden structures sagging under creeping vines, ringed by a decaying perimeter fence, the outpost, no flag, no smoke, no sound. The jungle seemed to lean inward, reclaiming it inch by inch. I felt a chill despite the heat, a sensation I couldn't explain, like stepping onto ground that remembered something terrible. Our lieutenant raised his hand, signaling silence, though there was nothing to be silent for. We advanced slowly, boots sinking into mud that showed no recent tracks. The gate hung open, not forced, just left that way. The watchtower stood empty, ladder intact, as if the sentry had climbed down and never returned. Standing there, rifle raised, sweat stinging my eyes, I understood the true meaning of those orders. This place didn't just lack coordinates. It lacked acknowledgement. It was a place meant to be forgotten, scrubbed from memory and record alike. And as we crossed the threshold into the outpost, a thought settled in my mind, cold and certain. Whatever had driven the previous occupants away had done so without firing a single shot. If the paperwork felt wrong, the silence of the jungle when we arrived felt worse. The outpost looked deserted, but it did not feel unoccupied. Crossing the perimeter felt like stepping into a room where someone had just stopped speaking. Our boots sank into soft earth layered with fallen leaves, the ground damp and warm as if it still remembered footsteps that no longer existed. The buildings were arranged with military precision. Barracks to the left, command hut at the center, a radio shack slightly elevated on wooden stilts. Yet vines crawled across walls, and moss climbed corners like a slow infection. The jungle was reclaiming everything with quiet patience. I remember thinking that nature here did not rage or tear things down. It simply waited, confident that time was on its side. We swept the barracks. First, doors creaked open to reveal bunks neatly made, mosquito nets tucked in with care on one table. A metal mess tray still held hardened rice and a half-eaten ration, mold blooming across it in pale green veins, flies scattered as light cut into the room. There were cups with dried coffee rings, boots lined up beneath bunks, letters folded and placed carefully on wooden shelves. Everything suggested order. Not panic. No smashed furniture. No blood. No signs of a fight. It was as if the men had stood up at the same moment and walked out together, convinced they would return shortly. That unsettled me more than chaos ever could. In the armory hut, rifles leaned against the wall in tidy rows, bolts removed and stacked separately, cleaned and oiled. Munition crates were sealed, counted, labeled with dates only weeks old. No army abandons weapons like that unless ordered to, or unless they believe weapons won't help. I felt a prickle along my spine at that thought. Our lieutenant said nothing, only marked each structure cleared in his notebook, though I noticed his hand tremble slightly when he wrote. Outside, the jungle pressed, closer than it had beyond the wire, leaves brushing the walls as if testing boundaries. It felt intrusive, almost deliberate. The command hut revealed the most disturbing detail. A chalkboard still listed duty rotations, names written in careful script, the last entry unfinished. The chalk snapped mid-word. Maps were pinned to the wall, but unlike ours, these showed markings. Hand-drawn symbols clustered around the outpost, areas circled and crossed out again and again. The dates beside them ended abruptly. I leaned closer and noticed scratches in the wood near the doorway. Deep gouges at shoulder height, not random, but repeated, as if something had been dragged past again and again. Our guide refused to step inside. He stood outside, eyes fixed on the tree line, whispering prayers under his breath. As daylight began to fade, the quality of the air changed, the heat lingered, but a damp chill crept beneath it, raising gooseflesh on my arms. Insects returned in force, their buzzing loud enough to mask softer sounds. Soft enough that you questioned whether you'd heard them at all. I caught movement at the edge of my vision more than once, only to find nothing but hanging vines swaying gently. Our perimeter check revealed no breaches, yet the fence felt symbolic now, more suggestion than barrier. The jungle did not respect straight lines or human claims. At dusk, we gathered in the radio shack to establish contact with command. The generator sputtered, then settled into a low, Uneven hum. The operator adjusted dials, headphones pressed tight, frustration etched across his face. First, there was only static. A familiar hiss, comforting in its normality. Then, beneath it, came something else. A rhythmic pattern, not quite a voice. Not quite interference. It rose and fell, almost like breathing, too steady to be random. The operator frowned and adjusted, frequency after frequency, but the sound followed, slipping between channels like it belonged there. I leaned closer, feeling an inexplicable urge to lower my voice despite the noise. The sound shifted, thinning, then thickening again, and for a moment, just a moment, I thought I heard syllables stretched and distorted, as if someone were trying to speak through water. The operator went pale and pulled off the headphones, swearing he'd heard his name spoken softly, right against his ear. We laughed it off, forced and loud, the way men do when fear needs a mask. But no one put the headphones back on. Night fell quickly after that. Torches cast weak cones of light that barely pushed back the darkness beyond the buildings. The jungle responded with sound. Branches creaking, distant calls echoing too long, too hollow. I stood watch near the barracks, rifle heavy in my hands, sweat cooling on my skin, and my thoughts kept returning to those untouched meals, the stacked rifles, the unfinished chalk mark. These were not the signs of defeat. They were signs of interruption. Somewhere beyond the wire, something moved, not rushed, not cautious, just present. The jungle did not part for it, did not react the way it did to animals or it was as if the forest itself held its breath. When the radio crackled once more inside the shack, unprompted, I knew with sick certainty that whatever had emptied this outpost had not left with the soldiers. That first night taught us the outpost was not empty. It was waiting. The jungle learned our names faster than we learned its paths. The first sound came during the second watch, long after the men had settled into uneasy routines and forced calm. That I was posted near the outer fence where the trees leaned close, their branches tangled like grasping fingers. The air was thick with damp heat, my uniform clinging to my skin, the smell of mildew and oil mixing with rot from the forest floor. At first, it was only a faint rustle, the kind any soldier learns to ignore in jungle terrain. But this was different. It followed rhythm rather than chance, slow, deliberate steps circling just beyond the wire. I tightened my grip on the rifle and strained my eyes into the darkness, torchlight catching nothing but leaves and shadow. The steps stopped the moment I focused on them, as if whatever made them understood attention. I told myself it was an animal. Yet animals do not pace. They dart, retreat, flee. These steps lingered. They returned again minutes later, closer this time, stopping directly opposite me on the other side of the fence. The silence around them was heavier than sound, pressing against my ears until my own breathing felt too loud. I called out softly, challenging whatever stood there, and no response and no movement. Just the sensation of being observed with patience that felt unsettlingly human. When I reported it at shift change, the corporal nodded without surprise and told me I was the third man to mention footsteps that night. By the third day, the whispers began. They were not clear voices, not at first, more like fragments carried on the air, woven between the calls of insects and distant birds. A sigh that didn't belong to the wind, a murmur that faded when you tried to focus on it. The men grew irritable, snapping at one another over small things. Sleep-deprived and tense, I caught one soldier standing alone by the fence at midday, staring into the trees with unfocused eyes. He told me he thought he'd heard his mother calling him, using a childhood nickname no one else knew. I laughed it off in front of him. But later, alone, I remembered the radio operator swearing the static had spoken his name too. The jungle itself seemed to respond to these sounds. Trees creaked without wind, vines shifted as if brushed aside by something unseen. On patrol within the perimeter, we found impressions in the mud that defied easy explanation. Not footprints, not claw marks, but elongated depressions that suggested weight distributed unnaturally, as if something tall had paused there briefly, then vanished without continuing on. No tracks led away. Our guide refused to approach them. He stopped several meters back, shaking, whispering the same word again and again under his breath. I didn't understand the language, but I understood the fear. At dusk, the whispers grew bolder. I was inside the command hut when I heard it clearly for the first time. A voice close to my ear, low and intimate, speaking German with the faintest distortion, like sound passing through water. It said my surname once. Slowly I spun around, heart pounding, weapon raised, But the room was empty. The lamp flickered overhead, casting shadows that stretched and bent unnaturally along the walls. That I stood there longer than I should have, frozen by the certainty that whatever spoke had known exactly where to stand, so I could feel its breath but never see its form. That night, the sentries doubled without formal order, and no one wanted to be alone. The whispers continued, sometimes overlapping, sometimes mimicking the voices of men within our unit. Calls for help came from beyond the wire, pleading and familiar, yet always wrong in subtle ways. The tone slightly off, the timing unnatural. As trained soldiers, we knew better than to respond. Yet knowing did nothing to ease the instinctive pull to answer when you heard your own name spoken softly in the dark. One man broke discipline and approached the fence before we could stop him. That he stared into the trees, face slack, as if listening to instructions only he could hear. When we dragged him back, he resisted weakly, tears streaming down his face, repeating that someone was asking him to come closer. Sleep became fragmented, haunted by dreams that bled into waking moments. That I dreamed of standing watch while something stood behind me, close enough that I could feel its presence but never turned fast enough to see it. When I woke, the sensation lingered. The jungle felt nearer, tighter, like a living wall slowly closing. That I noticed the outpost's old markings more clearly now. Scratches on doors, strange symbols carved shallowly into posts. Too weathered to be recent but too deliberate to be decorative. These were not military marks. They felt like warnings left by people who knew language was insufficient. On the fourth evening, our guide finally spoke more than a few words. He pointed into the forest and said the whispers belonged to a watcher. Something drawn to abandoned places and unsettled ground. Something that followed armies because we're left behind fear and vacancy. He refused to name it, insisting names invited attention. His hands shook as he spoke, eyes darting constantly toward the tree line as if expecting interruption. Our lieutenant dismissed it as superstition, but his voice lacked conviction. I saw him later, standing alone near the radio shack, listening to the jungle with the same strained focus I felt. As darkness fell, the whispers quieted suddenly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt staged. Even insects fell still. That silence carried intent, like a held breath before speech. I knew then that the forest was not merely surrounding us, that it was listening, and whatever walked among those trees was learning us carefully, patiently, preparing for something more direct. The stories did not begin with us. They had been waiting for soldiers to listen. The guide broke his silence on the fifth morning, not because we asked again, but because the jungle itself seemed to press the words out of him. We were preparing a perimeter patrol when he stopped suddenly, gripping his machete with white knuckles, his eyes fixed on a cluster of old trees beyond the fence. Thick trunks scarred by age and something else, long vertical marks carved deep into the bark. That he said the ground there was claimed, not by any nation or army, but by something older than uniforms or flags. The outpost, he insisted, had been built on land that was never meant to be occupied, once abandoned. That he spoke carefully, choosing each word as if the forest were eavesdropping. He told us the stories were passed quietly between villages, never written down. The Watcher, as he called it, followed disruption. It was drawn to places where people arrived with purpose and left unfinished business behind. It did not attack immediately. It observed. It learned habits, voices, routines. When the balance felt wrong, it intervened, not out of anger but correction. War, he said, was especially dangerous because it left behind fear soaked into the ground. The outpost had been evacuated. Once before, long ago, by locals who claimed the trees began speaking their names at night. They abandoned the area and warned others to stay away. But armies do not listen to warnings that are not written in their own language. We reacted the way trained men always do when confronted with folklore. We smiled thinly, exchanged looks, dismissed it as fear dressed up as myth. Yet none of us mocked him outright. The past nights had stripped us of that confidence. I watched the lieutenant's face as the guide spoke. He did not interrupt, he did not scoff, he simply listened, jaw tight, eyes narrowed, and thought. Later, when I asked him privately what he believed, he said belief was irrelevant. Some threats required proof. Others only required pattern. And this place, he admitted, followed a pattern he did not like. That afternoon, we explored deeper into the outpost's neglected edges. We found an older structure partially collapsed, overgrown and forgotten beneath vines and roots. Inside, scratched into the walls, were crude markings, figures elongated and faceless, surrounded by lines that suggested movement rather than form. These were not native designs, nor military symbols. They were desperate attempts to describe something that resisted shape. The center of the room lay a small pile of objects. Buttons, identity tags, a rusted harmonica. All left deliberately, arranged as if an offering or apology. The smell inside was stale, heavy with damp wood and decay, yet beneath it lingered something sharp and metallic that caught at the back of my throat. As dusk approached, the atmosphere shifted again. The jungle darkened faster than usual, shadows stretching unnaturally long across the compound. The whispers returned, but changed. They were closer now, more confident and no longer fragmented or distant. They came from just beyond the walls, sliding between the buildings like unseen patrols. That I heard laughter once. Soft, almost amused, followed by a pause, as if waiting for reaction, and no one laughed back. We pretended not to hear it, each man retreating. Inward, checking weapons that already felt insufficient. The guide refused to remain inside the wire after sunset. He insisted the watcher respected boundaries only when acknowledged, not when challenged. He moved to the far edge of the compound and marked the ground with symbols drawn in ash and dirt. Muttering prayers older than any language I knew, some of the men scoffed quietly. But no one stopped him. Desperation makes room for strange rituals. When night finally settled, the stars above felt distant and indifferent, obscured by drifting mist that caught torchlight and bent it into warped shapes. The outpost looked less like a military position and more like a forgotten ruin, temporarily inhabited by men who did not belong. During second watch, I heard movement inside the compound where no one was posted, not footsteps, but the sound of cloth brushing against wood. Slow and deliberate, I followed it to the old collapsed structure, heart hammering, rifle raised. The noise stopped as soon as I approached. The air inside felt colder, heavier, pressing against my chest. I had the distinct sensation of standing in a space already occupied, like interrupting a conversation that ceased the moment I arrived. I backed away, slowly, unwilling to turn my back, until the torchlight rejoined the rest of the compound. Only then did I realize my hands were shaking. The guide approached me later, eyes wide, and asked what it had sounded like when I told him. He nodded grimly and said that meant it had crossed from watching to testing. He warned that the watcher would soon take something small to see how we responded. A mistake, he said, would invite something far worse. His words stayed with me as I lay awake, listening to the jungle breathe around us, aware that the stories were no longer distant folklore. They were becoming instructions, lessons written in fear by those who had survived long enough to leave warnings behind. As the night deepened, a single realization settled over me with chilling clarity. The outpost had not been abandoned because it was unimportant. It had been abandoned because it was understood. And understanding, in this place, had always come too late. The jungle didn't take him violently. It took him quietly, like a decision already made. The disappearance happened on the 6th day, during what should have been the safest assignment inside the perimeter. I remember the exact hour because the heat had begun to break. The sky dimming into that uneasy gray that comes before dusk. We had adjusted our routines by then. No lone sentries beyond the wire, no unnecessary patrols, no wandering after sunset. The guide's warning echoed in all of us, even if no one spoke it aloud. The watcher would take something small first. That was what he'd said. And small, in war, usually meant one man. Gefreiter Klaus Richter was assigned to check the eastern fence line with another soldier. A simple inspection we'd done dozens of times before. They moved within sight of the watchtower, never more than a few dozen meters away. I was near the barracks when Richter raised his hand casually, signaling all clear. Then he stepped behind a storage shed overgrown with vines, and he never came back out. At first, no one noticed. The jungle has a way of swallowing attention. The other soldier completed the circuit and returned alone. When asked where Richter was, he frowned, confused, insisting Richter had turned back earlier. That contradiction sent a cold ripple through the group. We searched immediately, rifles ready, voices raised despite the unspoken rule against calling out, and a response. The area behind the shed showed disturbed leaves, but no signs of struggle, and no dragged marks, and no blood. His rifle was found leaning carefully against a post, safety engaged, strap folded neatly as if placed with intention. It was the kind of thing a man does when he expects to return in seconds. That detail unsettled us deeply. You don't abandon a weapon in hostile territory unless you are certain you won't need it, or unless something convinces you it won't help. As night approached, tension thickened the air. The guide refused to participate in the search beyond sunset, warning that calling for the lost invited imitation. We ignored him at first, desperation outweighing superstition. But when darkness fell and the jungle responded with unnatural stillness, even the lieutenant ordered us back inside the wired. We secured doors, doubled watches, and waited. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of wood, every brush of leaves sounded deliberate, purposeful, as if the outpost itself were holding its breath. It was just after midnight when we heard Richter's voice. He called out from beyond the fence, calm, almost conversational. He used my name first, then others, repeating them slowly, patiently, like someone reading from a list. The voice was perfect in tone, pitch, and cadence. Yet something about it felt wrong. Too measured, too clean, stripped of urgency or fear. No man lost in the jungle calls like that. The guide began to weep quietly, rocking back and forth, whispering that it had learned how to speak. One soldier moved toward the gate before we could stop him. Drawn by instinct stronger than training, that we tackled him, dragged him back as Richter's voice shifted suddenly, dropping into a whisper that sounded almost disappointed. The calls continued for several minutes, circling the perimeter without footsteps, without rustling foliage. Then they stopped all at once. The jungle resumed its noise as if nothing had happened. The abrupt normalcy was worse than the voice itself. It felt like laughter. At first light, we searched again, farther this time. The guide marked the ground nervously, muttering prayers under his breath. We found Richter near the edge of a shallow ravine less than a kilometer from the outpost. He was standing upright, back to us, boots clean, uniform unwrinkled when we called his name. He did not respond as we approached. I felt a pressure in my head, a warning instinct screaming for distance. He turned slowly, movements stiff and precise. His eyes were open, unfocused, reflecting light without recognition. There were no wounds, no blood, no signs of violence, just a look of profound emptiness, as if whatever had animated him had already left. The medics confirmed what we already knew: he was dead, had been for hours. Yet his body showed no indication of how. The guide refused to come closer, insisting the watcher return things it no longer needed. As a lesson, we carried Richter back in silence, and no one met anyone else's eyes. We buried him beyond the wire, marking the grave quickly, without ceremony. The jungle seemed to close over the disturbed earth almost immediately, leaves settling as if eager to erase the evidence. That night, no one spoke after dark. We sat with our backs to walls, weapons across our laps, listening to the forest breathe around us. I kept thinking about the rifle left behind, the calmness of the voice, the care with which Richter had been placed where we would find him. This was not random. This was instruction. The watcher had taken something small, just as the guide warned, and returned it altered, emptied, to show us the rules. We were no longer occupiers. We were participants in something older, something that did not recognize ranks or flags. As the generator hummed unevenly and the radio hissed with lifeless static, I understood that Richter's disappearance was not the climax. It was an introduction. And whatever waited in the jungle now knew exactly how we would respond when it took the next thing. I saw it clearly enough to know it was real, and not clearly enough to ever describe it honestly. After Richter's burial, the outpost changed in ways that were difficult to explain but impossible to ignore. The jungle no longer felt like something surrounding us. It felt integrated, threaded through the buildings, watching from every angle. We stopped pretending discipline would save us. Formations loosened, orders shortened, conversations reduced to necessities. Every man conserved energy, not for battle, but for endurance. Fear became something we rationed carefully. It was during a late afternoon storm that the watcher finally revealed itself to me. Rain fell in thick sheets, hammering tin roofs and turning paths to slick mud. Visibility dropped to a few meters, the world reduced to gray haze and shadow. I was assigned to check the generator shed after a power fluctuation. Moving alone despite the new unspoken rule against isolation, the hum of the generator was uneven, like an irregular heartbeat. As I stepped inside, the air felt wrong, cooler, heavier, carrying that same metallic scent I'd noticed before. I heard movement behind me, not footsteps, but a shift in pressure, as if the space itself had adjusted to accommodate something new. I turned slowly, heart pounding, rifle raised. The torchlight caught a shape near the far wall. Not solid, not empty, but a distortion, like heat rising off metal. It stood taller than any man, elongated proportions bending subtly as it moved. When it shifted, The shadows around it moved first, then the shape followed, slightly delayed, as if reality itself struggled to keep up. I could not see a face, only the suggestion of one forming and unforming, features hinted at and then erased. I wanted to shout, to fire, to do something that fit my training, but my body refused to respond. Fear pinned me in place more effectively than any weapon. The shape tilted its head, studying me with curiosity that felt intimate and invasive. That moment, I realized it was not hunting blindly. It was learning reactions, cataloging responses. The radio on the shelf crackled suddenly, a burst of static slicing through the rain. The shape seemed to ripple in response, as if sound irritated it. I squeezed the trigger instinctively. The rifle barked, muzzle flash lighting the shed in stark white. The shot passed through the shape without resistance, striking the wall behind it. No impact, no reaction. The phantom did not flinch. It simply stepped closer. As it moved, the temperature dropped sharply, breath fogging before my face despite the heat outside. My ears rang with a low hum. Not a sound exactly, but a pressure that vibrated through bone rather than air. I felt memories surface unbidden. Faces from home, half-forgotten voices, moments of fear I thought buried. The phantom did not speak. Yet I understood with chilling clarity that it could access these things, not by reading thoughts, but by provoking them, drawing them out through proximity. I stumbled backward, breaking the spell, and ran into the rain, shouting for help. The men arrived quickly, weapons raised, torches cutting frantic patterns through the storm. They saw nothing. The shed was empty. The generator steady once more. When I tried to explain, words failed me. How do you describe something that refuses form, that exists more as intent than body? Some believed me immediately, others wanted to, but fear demanded denial. The guide looked at me with quiet resignation and said the watcher had decided I was worth showing itself to. That was not a compliment. It was a warning. That night, the phantom moved freely. It passed through the outpost without regard for walls or fences. Men reported seeing shadows detach from torchlight, figures standing where none should fit, movements that defied angles and distance. It mimicked voices again, but now with precision, repeating phrases spoken hours earlier, copying laughter, commands, even prayers. It was no longer testing. It was asserting presence. Gunfire erupted once, then stopped abruptly. The soldier who fired claimed his weapon jammed after a single shot, metal warped as if exposed to extreme cold. No one questioned his story. By dawn, exhaustion weighed on us heavier than feared. We gathered in the command hut, pale and silent, listening to the rain fade into mist. The guide told us the watcher had revealed itself because we had stayed too long. It respected boundaries only when departure followed acknowledgement. We had acknowledged it. Now we were refusing to leave. That imbalance, he warned, would demand correction. Our lieutenant finally broke his silence and ordered a full withdrawal request transmitted immediately. The radio hissed, sputtered, then went dead mid-transmission. No response, no confirmation. The jungle outside seemed to lean closer, branches creaking under their own weight. As the light strengthened, I stood near the fence, staring into the trees where the phantom had last been sensed. I felt watched, but not with hostility, with expectation. The watcher had shown itself not to frighten us away, but to inform us of a truth we had ignored. This place was not abandoned because it was dangerous. It was dangerous because it was inhabited by something that did not tolerate permanence. We had crossed from witnesses to intruders, and the jungle, patient as ever, was waiting to see how we would correct that mistake. The final night did not begin with screams. It began with orders that arrived too late. The message from command never came. The radio remained dead no matter how many times we checked connections or swapped parts. The realization settled slowly, like poison in the bloodstream. We were alone. Not temporarily cut off. Not delayed. Abandoned in the most literal sense. That knowledge changed the way the men moved, the way they looked at one another. The idea of evacuation still existed, but now it felt theoretical, something remembered rather than planned. The jungle had already decided the timetable. The storm returned after sunset, heavier than before. Thunder rolled low and distant, vibrating through the ground rather than echoing through the sky. Rain fell in violent bursts, reducing visibility to nothing beyond a few meters. Torches reflected off sheets of water, creating shifting walls of light and shadow. The outpost felt smaller, tighter, as if the buildings had drawn closer together. I was stationed near the command hut when the first scream cut through the rain, short, sharp, and immediately silenced. It came from the direction of the barracks. We moved instinctively, training overriding fear for once, weapons raised, boots slipping in the mud. Inside the barracks, chaos reigned. Bunks were overturned, mosquito nets torn loose, personal belongings scattered across the floor. Yet there was no blood and no obvious signs of struggle. One man sat against the wall, shaking uncontrollably, eyes fixed on nothing. When we shook him, he whispered that the walls had opened, that the shadows had stepped out and spoken orders in the lieutenant's voice, commanding men to follow. He pointed to an empty bunk and said the soldier sleeping there had stood up calmly and walked straight into the wall as if it weren't solid, and no one laughed and no one questioned him. We had all seen enough to understand the rules no longer applied. The phantom did not reveal itself openly that night. It didn't need to. It moved through absence, through gaps in attention, through moments when eyes blinked or torches turned away. Men vanished between heartbeats. A sentry posted by the gate was gone when the relief arrived, his helmet resting neatly on the ground where he had stood. The guide begged us to leave immediately, to flee into the jungle while movement was still possible. But the jungle was no escape. The Watcher owned the spaces between trees as completely as it owned the outpost. Staying or running felt equally futile. At some point, the generator failed completely, plunging the compound into near-total darkness. Torches sputtered in the rain, their light weak and unreliable. The sounds changed then. Not whispers, not voices, but the deep creak of wood under strain, the groan of metal bending slowly, deliberately. Buildings shifted slightly, not collapsing, but rearranging. Corridors subtly misaligned, so familiar paths led somewhere wrong. I ran from the barracks toward the radio shack and found myself at the fence. Instead, though I had not turned, it was as if the outpost itself had been edited while we weren't looking. I caught a glimpse of the phantom once more near the center of the compound. Clearer than before. It was no longer merely distortion. It had learned shape from us. Long limbs bent at familiar angles, a torso that suggested armor without wearing it. I recognized fragments of uniforms in its outline, textures borrowed from memory rather than matter. It stood still, observing the panic it had orchestrated with detached interest. This was not rage or hunger. This was enforcement. The Watcher was correcting an error that had persisted too long. Gunfire erupted sporadically, flashes of light illuminating terror-stricken faces before plunging them back into darkness. The shots achieved nothing except revealing positions. I saw one soldier fire point-blank at empty space, only for the recoil to throw him backward as if struck by an unseen force. He did not rise. The rain washed over him, erasing his outline until he became just another shape on the ground. I lost track of time then. The night stretched, elastic and endless, punctuated by sudden silence and bursts of chaos. Men scattered. Some barricaded themselves inside buildings. Others ran blindly, shouting orders no one followed. Near dawn, the storm eased. The jungle quieted in unnatural unison, and I found myself crouched behind the radio shack with two others, exhausted, soaked, shaking. The outpost was unrecognizable. Structures leaned at odd angles. Fences sagged or lay flat. The ground was churned, yet bore no clear tracks. The silence pressed down hard, heavier than any sound. We waited for something else to happen, convinced the worst was still coming. But nothing did. The Watcher had finished. As the first gray light filtered through the mist, we emerged cautiously. There were no bodies in the open, no wounded calling for aid, only absence. We counted again and again, hoping our minds had failed us. More than half the unit was gone, erased without trace. The guide said nothing. He only looked at the ground and nodded once, as if confirming an outcome he had always known. The outpost stood quiet, emptied of resistance, claimed fully now. That morning, as we gathered the few remaining supplies and prepared to leave on foot without orders or destination, I understood the true horror of the night. It was not the deaths, it was the efficiency. The Watcher had removed us the way one removes an infestation, leaving no excess, no mess, no story that could be easily told. What remained was silence, and the certainty that if we stayed any longer, there would be no one left to remember we had ever been there. Some places do not want witnesses. They allow survivors only so the warning can travel. We left the outpost at first light, not as a unit, but as remnants. The discipline that once defined us had been stripped away, replaced by a shared, unspoken understanding that rank no longer mattered. The jungle opened just enough to let us pass, then closed behind us without ceremony. No pursuit, no final threat that it didn't need to follow. We were already marked by memory alone as we moved. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind us, to feel that pressure in the air again. But the Watcher was finished. It had corrected the imbalance. It had no further interest. The march out blurred into exhaustion and hunger. We navigated by instinct and broken compass readings, driven by the simple need to put distance between ourselves and that place. The guide led without hesitation now, as if relieved, moving quickly, urging us onward whenever we slowed. He said nothing until we reached a shallow river where we stopped to drink and clean the mud from our faces. There, finally, he spoke. He told us the Watcher would not follow beyond the land it claimed. It did not roam. It waited. It endured. He said that was why armies returned again and again to the same cursed ground. They mistook silence for absence. When we reached friendly territory days later, the questions began. Why was our unit under strength? Where were the others? What had happened at the outpost? Our lieutenant delivered a version of events stripped of anything that could not be justified on paper. Disease, desertion, combat losses during a storm. None of it felt convincing, but none of it was challenged. Reports were filed. Casualty lists adjusted. The outpost was labeled untenable and removed from future planning. No investigation followed. Inquiry team was sent. The place faded into administrative oblivion with unsettling ease. It was as if command already knew some answers were better left undocumented. I was reassigned soon after, transferred to another theater, another jungle, another set of orders that looked clean and official. This time, the maps were detailed, the objectives clear. And yet, I found myself scanning the edges of every camp, listening too closely to the dark. My sleep never fully returned. In dreams, I stood at the outpost gate again, watching shadows move where no light should allow them to. I woke with the certainty that survival had not been a victory. It had been permission. Years passed. The war ground on, then ended. The world shifted, borders redrawn. Uniforms retired. I carried the story quietly, sharing fragments only with those who had been there, and even then, rarely. When I did speak, words felt insufficient. How do you explain a presence that leaves no proof? A force that kills without violence and teaches without speech? Eventually, I learned that others had stories too. Whispers from different fronts, different wars, all circling the same truth. Abandoned. Places do not become empty. They become occupied by whatever patience remains behind. Long after the fighting ended, I heard that the jungle had swallowed the outpost entirely. No structures remained, no clearings, no fence line. Locals avoided the area still, leaving small offerings at the tree line, marking boundaries with symbols I now recognized. They said the Watcher slept again, satisfied, undisturbed. That knowledge brought me no comfort. It only reinforced the lesson we learned too late. War teaches men to believe land is something to be taken, held, reshaped by will and force. But some ground resists ownership not with bullets or blades, but with memory. It remembers every intrusion, every unfinished departure, every fear soaked into its soil, and when disturbed too deeply, it responds in ways that do not fit military doctrine or human understanding. The outpost was never cursed. It was occupied. By something that outlasts armies, ideologies, and generations. I survived because I left when leaving was finally allowed. Not because I was stronger or smarter, but because the Watcher had finished correcting the mistake we represented. That is the truth I carry, heavier than any weapon I ever held. Some missions fail, some are erased. And some succeed only in becoming warnings, passed quietly from mouth to mouth, from story to legend, so that the next soldiers might hesitate before claiming ground that was never meant to be held. This story is inspired by documented wartime reports, blended with folklore, and dramatized for narrative purposes.